Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. My guest today is Richard Shusterman, who is an American pragmatist philosopher and a professor of philosophy at Florida Atlantic University. He's the author of several books, including Pragmatism and the Philosophical Life, Body Consciousness, A Philosophy of Mindfulness and Somaesthetics, and Thinking Through the Body. He's worked and travelled widely and is arguably something of a polymath, having held appointments in various disciplines in the humanities. For example, he taught comparative literature in Israel. He's been the visiting research professor in aesthetics in Hiroshima, Japan, and he was an associate of the École des Hautes Études in Sciences Sociales, pardon my pronunciation there, in Paris. He's also a professional practitioner of the Feldenkrais method, and he's perhaps most well known for his contributions to aesthetics and the emerging field of Somaesthetics. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. Hello, Richard. Welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Barry.
Okay, well, could we begin, Richard, by you maybe telling us a bit about your background and what led to you creating the discipline of Somaesthetics?
Well, as you said, I have a background in philosophy, and in some ways, Somaesthetics was my path to the middle way, because I started out as a kind of hardcore analytic philosopher. I'm a binational. I did my undergraduate BA and then my graduate MA at Hebrew University in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And I did logic and philosophy of language there. And I was also a officer in Israeli intelligence for 3.5 years before I came to Oxford to do my doctorate there in St. John's College. And my formation there was very alpha male, extreme in that sort of logical sense, yeah. and hard. And then after several years, I came to the United States, and through a personal crisis, a split up of my family, I was groping around for bearings, and I ran into a company of dancers. Well, not a professional company. Actually, there were 6 dancers who took my PhD seminar at Temple University in Philadelphia. And through them, I learned to encounter a very different way, much more yin as opposed to the yang of my philosophical and military education, and very much into spontaneity and the body and dance and receptivity and gentleness, and not so much of the critical reflection and logic. Of course, my military training was a very deeply embodied training, but it was a very different one. And so that was a kind of other extreme of the spontaneity and creativity. And my philosophical work changed as a result of that deep encounter with the dancers. I went from being a straightforward analytic philosopher to pragmatism that's much more embodied and involved with the experiential. And I wrote an important paper, at least important for me, but it's been widely cited, called Beneath Interpretation, which is all about that level beneath interpretation and beneath language that is very meaningful, and that philosophers and lots of other people in academia tend to forget. And that was part of the spontaneity and flow. But then I realized, and this is where I come to the middle way in terms of my own personal development, that spontaneity, for all its appearance, superficial appearance of freedom and liberty, is very often, in fact, most of the time, just going on automatic where you're a slave to your habits. Mm-hmm. So it's not that you're completely free. You're just behaving by your second nature, which includes or is formed by the habits that you're trained in. And many of these habits aren't very good, either because we haven't had a very productive and fruitful and caring education, or because of just coincidences that change the way we use ourselves and perform our activities. And so just being spontaneous can also be a recipe for misfortune.
Sure.
And so I then became interested in seeing that you need also reflective bodily experience, that the body isn't a synonym for non-thinking or unthinking, and that advocates of the body in philosophy and in practices like dance, in emphasizing the importance of spontaneity, bodily spontaneity and automaticity, and just do it, are missing out on an important dimension of our somatic lives, which is the ability of our soma. And this is really why I use the term soma instead of body, because I conceive of the soma as the living, sentient, dynamic, perceptive, and purposive body.
Yeah.
The soma is capable of monitoring itself, both consciously and, in fact, unconsciously. And we can improve our performance and the quality of our lives by introducing moments of somatic reflection, or as I prefer to call it, somaesthetic reflection, to emphasize the aesthetic dimension of our perceptual experience. So that's sort of a way of framing my evolution into a somaesthetic philosopher who introduced this discipline. Of course, while I was with the dancers, I practiced a lot of different sort of body techniques until I came across the Feldenkrais method. And that method appealed to me because it had a very strongly scientific dimension. And I decided that I would, being a pragmatist philosopher, I thought that it's important that I learn at least one method to the point of being a fully qualified professional practitioner. And so I can go into that, in a follow-up question, but I did become a professional practitioner of the Feldenkrais method. And as you know from reading the book, I also spent time in a Zen cloister in Japan, studying meditation with a Zen master. But, I don't have any certificates from that. But what I gained is invaluable and no less important than any academic study that I pursued.
Sure. Okay. Can we just look at somaesthetics in a little bit more detail? For example, how would you define it?
Okay. Well, I can define it as the critical study and ameliorative cultivation of the soma, or the body, as a site of sensory appreciation and perception. That's aesthesis. The word aesthetics comes from the Greek word aesthesis, which means simply sensory perception. And so the first part of somaesthetics is the critical study and ameliorative cultivation of the soma as our instrument of perception and performance and cognition. And the ameliorative dimension is very important because this is not simply a theoretical study. There's a practical dimension to it as well. And the second part of the definition is the same sort of critical study and meliorative cultivation of the soma as the site or place where we express our values and express ourselves in creative self-fashioning. So to understand that in simpler, more everyday terms, the first part of the Somaesthetics, where I talk about cultivating and examining how we use our body as a study of perception and experience, can be understood in an experiential way as sort of very closely connected with our inner perception and cognition. The other part is a more representational side, which is how we use our soma to express our values and creatively stylize ourselves. So Somaesthetics, goes from inner Zen meditation to aspects like fashion, cosmetics, tanning, and all the sort of bodily gestures, because we express our values also by the way we walk, the way we gesture. And so I wanted to combine and connect, because I think they are connected, what we simplistically divide as the inner and the outer, how we feel and how we look, because as the old proverb says, these things are connected. How we feel affects how we look, and vice versa. So that's a kind of general definition. I just want to emphasize one more time that it's a discipline of theory and practice. And so besides writing books, I give workshops, and the workshops, these are workshops in body consciousness, in heightening body consciousness. And I feel it's important to do these workshops to convey the message in the most powerful way that it can be conveyed, which is experientially and not linguistically. And I know my own conversion to this direction of philosophy, a more embodied, experientially based philosophy, came not from reading books, but from full-bodied experiences that I learned through my encounter with those dancers.
Yes. And one of the things that I find exciting about your work, Richard, is this acknowledgement that theory and practice are, inextricably linked. From a broader perspective, do you think people in general would engage with philosophy more effectively if they saw that it was as much something that you did as something that was just a cognitive endeavor?
No, I couldn't agree more. In fact, one of the books that you mentioned in your introduction, actually you gave the subtitle rather than the title.
Oh, excuse me.
That's okay. That's okay. I mean, the title is Practicing Philosophy, and then the subtitle is Pragmatism and the Philosophical Life. And that book, which was published in Britain by Routledge, I think in 1997, and it's been translated into a number of languages, is about this whole idea of reviving philosophy as a way of living, an art of living, and not having it confined to very technical, arcane academic discourse. And here again, I have a middle way, which is fruitful for me personally. I don't know whether it's the most advantageous career-wise, because people like dichotomies, and there's a lot of excitement and interest when the opposite camps fight with each other. They're fireworks, and everything is clear, and the confrontation seems clear, but the middle ground is kind of more muddled and maybe not as exciting, but it's actually not only a more comfortable but a more honest place to be.
Yeah.
So I guess here it's a question of not jumping from hyper sophisticated academic philosophy to a kind of mindless self-help book. It's trying to find a middle way, because what happens, I think, in our culture is that because philosophers have abandoned this sort of old idea of a path of wisdom and have confined themselves to a scientific discourse, the whole domain of paths of wisdom in life has been left open to other disciplines, including all, various kinds of healers and self-help books. And I have nothing against that genre. I mean, I find most of it a bit superficial, but, if it helps people, that's okay. But what I find missing is, in those works, for the most part, is the use and the implementation of good philosophical ideas of wisdom that we have in our tradition. Whether it's Socrates or Confucius or Montaigne or St. Augustine or William James. There are people all along the way, who had insights about these things.
Definitely.
And it's something, that's been, I don't want to say entirely lost. In France, through the work of Pierre Hadot and Michel Foucault, this idea has been resuscitated. But it's very much connected with pragmatism, with the ideas that philosophy should prove itself in practice. And pragmatism has actually had a lot of bad press, partly because of the name and partly because of the colorful ways that William James, for example, described it. Actually, since the Middle Way was founded in Britain, and you're from England, I can mention that Bertrand Russell, who was very critical of pragmatism, and he just associated with vulgar American commercialism, and he mentioned, William James used the metaphor of trying to see what the cash value of an idea is. And what he meant was, how does that idea, how is it tested in practice? What does it mean in practice? But because he used a commercial term, because he thought it's more colorful, it will speak to people more, instead of another abstract term like, observational content. What difference would that idea, if it's true, make in the world?
Yeah.
One way to explain that they've done in various directions of logical positivism and other scientifically oriented ways of thinking about philosophy is to talk about, observational content. He used the kind of more practical, colorful metaphor of the cash value. How is it cashed out in experience? And that idea that philosophy is a product of life experience and that it should be used to improve life is actually at the basis of both Western and Asian thought. I mean, Socrates wasn't an academic philosopher. He wrote no books. He published no papers. He, in fact, himself did not have any complicated theories. It was Plato who developed the theories through the persona of Socrates. Socrates' concern was how one should live and what knowledge does one need in order to guide one's life. So that practical dimension of philosophy is very important and very important to me. And Somaesthetics is a way of capturing that dimension with maybe catchier, less problematic term than pragmatism. And I can give you an interesting anecdote about that.
Yeah, go
on. I've been very fortunate in having good translators in various languages. I'm always hopeful, and actually I'm already confident that my translators actually improve my works when they translate them. And so I've had a very, very good reception in China, because China their philosophical tradition is very practically oriented. It's not very much about ontology and metaphysics. It's very practically oriented, and there are a lot of intersections with my work and traditional Chinese philosophy. So they were very enthusiastic about Somaesthetics, and in one of the main daily papers, actually it's the most important intellectual daily paper, the Guangming Daily, it's edited by the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and they've published articles about Somaesthetics and an interview with me, and they wanted an article from me. And so I had a very nice little article, very clear and pedagogical, what pragmatism means to me, 10 principles. I thought it's perfect for a newspaper because it's clear, it's simple and direct. Yeah. And after 2 weeks, the person who was connecting me with this newspaper sent me an email, very apologetic, that they cannot publish this article. And please don't be offended, it's for political reasons. And I said, yeah, why? And because it wasn't a very political piece, but what he explained is that pragmatism can be conceived as a competitor to Maoism, Leninism, Stalinism, and Marxism. Wow. It's another ism.
Yeah, so it hit the same wall as the one with Bertrand Russell then?
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, a bigger wall, because it's any kind of ism.
Yeah.
Like atomism or scientism, I think so, the second part of the sentence was, but they said, please send us something about Somaesthetics.
Right.
And so in some way, because the name, I think it's a mouthful, it's not particularly mellifluous or attractive, but I think it avoids some of the negative associations of pragmatism. And because it's not an ism, and because people are usually or sometimes friendlier to aesthetics because they just think it's something light and frivolous, they can absorb it maybe with less fear and more interest than another kind of ism.
Sure, I know I can relate to that. Just going back to what you were saying earlier about we're often more comfortable with dichotomies, or we crave certainty to an extent. And you talk a lot about ambiguity, and arguably Somaesthetics cultivates a tolerance of ambiguity. Would you say that it does that, and if that, and how important is that?
Well, I think one of the premises of Somaesthetics is that the Soma is an ambiguous entity, because it's both subject and object. As a instrument or our medium of perception, the Soma has a subjectivity. It has an intentionality. It knows things. It sees things. But it's also, from another perspective, an object in the world, which is how it knows things, because it's part of a world of objects, and so it can know those objects by acquaintance without all sorts of discursive mediation. So, that's one ambiguity. The Soma is also ambiguous in that it's a generality but very specific. We all basically have the same human shape. the same number of chromosomes, the same number of limbs, but we recognize other humans as much by their bodily form as by their rationality. But although the soma is a general, human universal, every one of us is different.
Yeah.
We all have our own fingerprints. We all have our different ways of moving. So the soma is ambiguous also in that sense, that it's both a general form for humanity and a very particular thing. It's ambiguous in the fact also that we use that generality to reach out ethically and emotionally to all the people in the world because we understand their suffering. But we also use the particularity of the soma to classify people into different races and ethnicities and genders, and use that kind of differential bodily profiling to discriminate against some of them. The body is ambiguous in terms of being both our source of power, but an instance of our weakness. So it's full of ambiguities. It's where we know things, but it's also the limits of our knowledge. So, yeah, it's also something that philosophers never like to talk about. Well, actually, they talk about it in some ways, but they've always found ways of overcoming it, which is the situation of mortality. The bodies are living organisms, but they're destined to die. That's part of their essence. And one of the reasons I think that philosophers have not focused as much on the body is their concern with identifying humanity with something that's more than human, with a kind of divine aspect. And until people reached an old age where Alzheimer's and other sort of cognitive impairments became obvious, it was more reasonable to think that, the body decays and dies, but the mind can go on forever.
Sure.
And so the focus on the mind and leaving the body as irrelevant to philosophy and care for the self as not being the self was a way of overcoming the identification of the self with something, mortal and transient. So ambiguity is, a big part of Somaesthetics, but I think the idea of Somaesthetics is not simply just to accept the ambiguity. It's also to try to make sense of the muddle. You can just say, well, it's just a murky muddle, and we just have to accept that and cope with it. But a lot of the Somaesthetic practice is about discriminating these feelings that are experienced in a confused way, but can be made clearer. So if let's say you're sitting now in a chair, you have a kind of ambiguous feeling of your weight on the chair. But if you concentrate and think carefully about it, or not so much think, but actually reflect on your sensation, you will probably find that one buttock has more weight on the chair, is pressing harder on the chair than the other. That when you're standing, one foot bears more weight than the other. That when you walk, you don't usually think about it, you start with one foot rather than another. So it's not simply accepting the ambiguities of our somatic existence. It's trying to understand them better, to reach a kind of clarity for two reasons. One is to reach the clarity so that you can improve your bodily performance.
Yeah.
You may have a tendency to injure yourself on one side because you don't realize that you're leaning on that side. And by noticing that you're leaning, or you're putting most of your body weight on that side, you can learn either to try to change that habit or to compensate for it in some way so that you'll be less prone to injure it. But aside from that kind of practical use, it can be fascinating to notice these things about yourself as just the pleasures of self-knowledge and the clarity, the intellectual fascination of connecting with yourself. I remember I had one very ecstatic moment in my Feldenkrais training when I suddenly, discovered in a very direct experiential way the precise feeling of one of my middle vertebrae. For most academics, and not even academics, most people who have a sedentary lifestyle, even if they work out a lot, the middle vertebrae in your back, we don't take much time to articulate them and pay attention to each particular vertebrae. And so, although we get input from all our bodily parts, we aren't consciously aware of that particular input from that particular vertebra. And when I finally felt that in a clear way, it was, an apotheosis, a kind of revelation or epiphany of suddenly feelings, getting acquainted with a part of me that was unknown before.
Fantastic.
So there are also these kind of pleasures of self-discovery. And actually, sometimes this is one of the nice things about giving the workshops, because some of them involve movements that we've all learned as a child and have in many ways are essential to developing more sophisticated movements like rolling and crawling, and then to come back and learn them again in a more conscious way through the workshop, it can be very liberating and fun for people to kind of go back and rediscover very simple, basic bodily pleasures. And I'll just add here one more dimension that could be connected with people in your society. There's an environmental, ecological aspect of Somaesthetics.
Okay.
And the idea here is that if you learn how to take more pleasure in your body through the very simple activities of walking, breathing, sitting, stretching, moving, you're less dependent on much more expensive and environmentally damaging bodily pleasures, whether it's, racing down the motorway in your Maserati or, taking in some kind of illegal, expensive and, dangerous substance. So the idea is that by heightening body consciousness, we can heighten our bodily pleasures without excessive demands on the environment. And the second part or dimension of this environmental friendly aspect of Somaesthetics is that since we can never feel our Soma alone, the Soma is always an element in an environmental field, which is a physical environment, but also a social environment. So the idea of developing reflective, acute, somaesthetic consciousness is not being an egomaniac and selfish. it means that you're more perceptive of how your soma fits in to the context in which it is. So that makes you, let's say, more sensitive to polluted air,
Yeah.
To polluted water, and makes you more concerned about keeping the air and water fresh. It makes you more sensitive to the suffering of others, because in being a somaesthetically sensitive soma, you automatically empathize with the somatic discomfort of others, which you can actually perceive. I can give you an example. Very many times, I give the practical examples because it's a practical philosophy.
Yeah.
Many times in academic conferences, I'm stopped by female academics who approach me with an incredibly lopsided posture because one of their shoulders is weighed down by a heavy handbag that usually has a laptop, a cell phone, a book or two, and a battery charger. And they stop in the middle of the conference, to ask me a question, and I have to tell them always, I'm happy to talk to you, but only on condition that you put your handbag down. Because I just feel uncomfortable.
Sure.
I see their posture is distorted and they cannot be comfortable how they're standing. But the way consciousness is, because of the focus on what they're interested in, they don't feel the discomfort.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but because I see it, I also feel it.
Yeah. And you feel uncomfortable.
Oh yeah, I think that's the idea, where developing this sensitivity doesn't make you autistic. It actually opens you up to the world, because that's another sort of false dichotomy that we have about the self and the other. Because it's a very basic one, because of course we distinguish ourselves from other people. We are individuals. Our society is individualistic. We all have our own passport number, license number, income tax number.
Yeah.
But when we think of who we are as individuals, we have absorbed many different voices that are not our own. And many of our personal ambitions, desires, and wishes make no sense unless we interpret them in terms of other people's expectations, desires, and wishes. So I think this was a problem that I had to face early on, because any focus on the body in a lot of Western intellectual discourse is associated with narcissism, the whole sort of top model bodybuilder, superficial, egotistic, self-centered mentality. And so it's been important for me to show the other directedness of the somaesthetic process.
But you're also at pains to point out, aren't you, Richard, that you're not discarding the representational aspect. It's more finding a balance between the two. Yeah.
Exactly. I think there's a very strong interaction between experience and the representation, the external dimension. And when I lived in New York for many years, my partner was a fashion designer. She worked for Armani and Perry Ellis and Marc Jacobs before she opened her own little company of women's accessories. And so an aesthetician, philosophical aesthetics, but I've always been motivated by beauty, by the beauty of art, but also the beauty of nature, which includes, human beauty. So I have no prejudice, like many philosophers do, for physical beauty, physical personal beauty. And what I sought in Somaesthetics is a way of connecting the two, because I needed initially to focus not on fashion and cosmetics, because the body already had that stereotype. And I knew that if I would focus on that, I would be written off as just celebrating all the ills of postmodern consumerist capitalist society. And I wouldn't get a hearing among my left-thinking, academic friends.
Sure.
And I thought Somaesthetics is important. And so actually, to tell you the truth, the first time I introduced the topic in a lecture, the reception was extraordinarily positive, but enthusiasm focused on two topics, neither of which I discussed in my lecture. One was food and the other was sex, right, because those are the two most basic and common bodily pleasures. And my aesthetics already in the pre-Somaesthetics days was known for advocating the importance of pleasure. And so in the same way that I didn't write about representational Somaesthetics, I wrote nothing about food or sex. And I went into the Asian meditative disciplines because I thought if I showed the spiritual dimensions of Somaesthetics, philosophers would take this discipline seriously. Yeah. And, they have. The strategy has been successful, and now it's successful. The field is well enough established. We have a journal. There's also now a new book series, Studies in Somaesthetics. So now I've allowed myself to do some research into the Somaesthetics of eating and sexuality without the fear that the discipline will be just dismissed as trivial.
And are you also encouraged by modern developments like that? For example, the popularity of mindfulness, or in neuroscience, the recognition now that emotion and reason, they can't be, they're not separate. And
no. I mean, as you know from my writings, I invoke neuroscience, when I think it's useful. And it's very interesting. I'll go back to pragmatism and William James. William James is one of the two founders of modern psychology. And his theory of emotion was that emotion is a bodily thing. And he also insisted that thinking is an affective, emotional, and bodily thing. He wrote a very interesting essay. I think it was published in Mind around the turn of the century, the beginning of the 20th century or the end of the 19th. It was called The Sentiment of Rationality. Wow. And the idea was that how do we judge whether something is reasonable or not? Ultimately, we feel somehow that it's right. All the axioms that we then can, axioms and steps and proofs, are all built ultimately on intuitions and feelings that you can move from here to there, or these axioms are good enough to start with. And so a lot of what neuroscience is doing is verifying philosophical ideas and intuitions that are deep in the pragmatist tradition with William James and John Dewey. But of course, it encourages me. I cite their work. But what for me is important is the necessity of going out of the laboratory and testing things, in real world contexts, and not because there are certain limits, when you wire electrodes to people, onto people. There are certain limits of movement that they have, and if they make bigger movement, there's just so much noise in the brain that you can't track those pathways and patterns so accurately. So I guess this is another principle that I have that's important in my work, is this idea of methodological pluralism. I'm a believer in the middle way, but I don't see the middle way as like one middle way. There are lots of middles, and life and philosophy are both very, very difficult, and you cannot rely on simply one tool in your toolbox.
Sure, yeah, I agree with you there. Yeah, just sticking with this theme a little bit longer. I know you're an old friend of another pragmatist philosopher and also a great admirer of John Dewey, Mark Johnson.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
To what extent do you see a connection with Mark Johnson and George Lakoff's theory of embodied meaning and Somaesthetics?
Well, there's obviously a connection, although not a causal one. We're both believers in the importance of body in thought. George Lakoff and Mark, did some work pretty early on I think in the 1980s, and my work came later. I think the big difference is that Somaesthetics has a kind of also a practical and meliorative dimension. It's not about describing the cognitive structures and how language gets formed from. It's concerned also with making things better, and it also is concerned with practical ways of making things better. So there's a whole kind of practical and pragmatic dimension. And it's also concerned with non-cognitive dimensions of our bodily experience. It's not trying simply to explain, language or ethical judgments. It's also about, I guess the other thing is, it's a big research project rather than a single theory. Yeah. So it's concerned with examining, let's say, the sociology of beauty in 19th century London, or because our concepts of beauty, even of bodily beauty, change. Once portly people were considered the ideal. Now it's all a culture of slimness and thinness. And so, part of the dimensions of Somaesthetics are not a theory of language or of cognition, but also social and historical research about how ideas of bodily stylization change and over time. What are the concepts of beauty or coolness, or what is appropriate bodily ornamentation at a particular time in a particular society. So it's concerned with things like, in principle, although I haven't theorized about it, tattoos, hairstyles, various representational things, also the ideologies of body practices. What is the ideology behind Pilates? What is the ideology behind the Alexander technique? So I think it's a broader research field rather than one theory. And I guess as I said, the difference is it's got a meliorative and practical dimension that's incredibly essential, and I guess maybe a bigger focus on aesthetic experience. Yeah. And I guess the other thing, it's a minor point, where I guess I came to embodiment through the dancers in this direct full measure, but I was prepared for it by my Oxford philosophical education in analytic philosophy because my supervisor at Oxford was J.O. Urmson, originally from Yorkshire, but he was the student of and literary executor of J.L. Austin, the philosopher of language who wrote, How to Do Things with Words and Performative Utterances. And besides studying Austin, I also studied Wittgenstein. And both these philosophers insisted that meaning is a function of use. And use is always in a practical context. And when you think it out, it's in a practical context, a social context, and a bodily context. Because when you do things, when someone says, bring 5 bricks, the meaning of bringing 5 bricks involves taking those bricks physically and bringing them. And so it was obvious to me that if meaning is use and use must be embodied, then meaning must be embodied.
Embodied too, yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of convergence. There's some, besides those 2 big points, there are minor points where I think Marx sees meaning at a realm where I see it as like on the way to meaning. But yeah, I think theoretically we have only very minor differences, and we have a lot of mutual support. And I think we also work in different ways. I think I'm much more, connected with concrete and maybe the aesthetic. But yeah, we have very good interactions. And what I can also say is that we both understand that philosophy should be honest.
Yes. Okay, great. Just sticking with this point a little bit more, where you were talking about the importance of the ameliorative approach to aesthetics. And what role judgment plays in some aesthetics. How, for example, might we judge the value of works of art, like, for example, the conflicts between popular and high art?
Yeah, well, judgment, our whole lives are full of judgments. Many of them are not articulated. We just judge, and our judgment is seen by our behavior. Let's say we're in the checkout queue at a supermarket. We can implicitly go to a certain line because we just either feel it's shorter or we know the checkout cashier and that she's fast rather than a slow one. Yeah. And without formulating it, it's a behavioral judgment. Just like we can suddenly, without thinking, walk into the shadier part of the street because we implicitly judge that it's too hot without even formulating it, when we're on the sunny side. A lot of Somaesthetics is about making judgments that we don't normally make, and we make them not to have the result of the judgment, but judgments have instrumental cognitive value in the way that they provoke us to think about things that we normally wouldn't think about. Okay. So if I say, now that you're sitting at your desk, I don't see you, but I assume you're sitting. If I asked you, whether the right buttocks or left buttocks is more firmly planted on your chair, asking you that question to make that judgment forces you to actually examine the way you're sitting and come to a conclusion. You might not be able to determine it. It might be too vague or ambiguous for you. But the very challenge to make the judgment is a way of focusing your attention to help give you greater knowledge and clarity about your somatic situation and about yourself, and then also maybe about your habits, and maybe about, whether that chair is comfortable.
Sure.
So judgments play a very basic role, but a role that is also a role of mediation, or a method of coming to clarity, or even a method of exploring. And even if you don't become clear, you're aware that you don't know the difference.
Yeah.
So it's judgments can be used in Somaesthetics, and are used in Somaesthetics practically, not simply for their conclusions, but for the experiences and thought processes that they are capable of provoking. Your question about art, it's very important. Artists have been better than philosophers traditionally in recognizing how the body expresses mental states.
Yeah.
I mean, what would portraiture be if we couldn't read the ideas and the feelings, whether joy or despair or devotion, in the religious paintings of the Renaissance or the Baroque?
Yeah.
I mean, and so art is very important for Somaesthetics. And actually, one dimension, I don't think it's a good idea to go into it very much in this talk, but because I work a lot with artists, and most of the practical workshops that I give have been to artist audiences. I've given it for choreographers, professional choreographers and dancers, for graduate students and performers in music, for visual artists, for people involved in human-computer interaction design. And as a result of my work with the artists, some of them, they just really want to be very direct. And when they want to know what's the connection between Somaesthetics and art, I've started myself to do some work as a performance artist to make the connection clearer. But what I don't want to go into this in detail here, but what I can just say as a result of that work is a recognition of the experiential dimension of artistic creation, which is part of what makes art important. Not just the objects that are exhibited, but, what makes art important for the artist who creates those objects is the whole performative process involved in the creation, which is exciting in itself. And for the viewer, it's also, when it's a powerful experience, it's also a kind of full-bodied immersion and recreation of experience, through the artwork. So there's a big bodily dimension, in art. And, in my earlier work, in the late 80s and early 90s, I was an advocate of the aesthetic value of popular arts, particularly rock music and rap. I got a lot of notoriety about that in Europe. For at least 5 years, I was, the philosopher of rap, especially in the continent. And that was actually one of the reasons that when I turned to Somaesthetics, I knew I couldn't talk about sex, because it would have reinforced the idea that I was just some kind of crazy provocateur who was looking for attention by working on these radical, transgressive topics. But one of the points that I made in defending the aesthetic importance of rock music and rap music was that we should not forget the embodied dimension of these arts. And part of their value is through the excitement, dynamic, and bodily experience that they give you when you dance to the music.
Yeah.
You know, they're not supposed to be consumed.
Sat down.
Yeah, in a seated position, you know, or driving in a car, you know, in a very quiet, meditative. It's not part of the aesthetic, and
No.
we cannot give those art forms the recognition that they deserve without understanding them in their context of creation and reception, which is very, you know, bodily.
Sure, yeah. Okay, you've mentioned the middle way on several occasions today, Richard, but what does it mean to you, if you could be a bit more succinct, and how does it relate to Somaesthetics?
Well, you know, I think the middle way is a way between two extremes. You know, with the Buddha, it was luxury and radical asceticism, both of which, you know, he rejected and found the middle way. There are lots of different middles. For me, you know, there's the golden mean, which is something that you also find in the Confucian tradition.
Yeah.
But I understand this, as I told you before, as not a single middle way. There are lots of ways of finding a middle, and I don't see it as a compromise.
No.
The middle way isn't simply a compromise. And it's also something that isn't like a mechanical average. I mean, the middle way for me does not completely renounce extremes. Also, the Buddha had to experience different extremes to find, you know, what his middle was.
Exactly.
And so, I mean, I remember this from Aristotle also talked about, you know, finding the proper mean between two extremes. And I remember, you know, one of the lessons that I learned in Oxford from my supervisor, Jay Ormson, was, you know, we shouldn't think of that middle as a mechanical one. It's not that you should drink a pint and a half of beer every night, and because that's your middle. You know, one night you can drink 5 and the other don't drink any.
Yeah.
It's not a mechanical thing. It requires sensitivity and, you know, that's right, discernment and discrimination and sensitivity. And here, you know, to conclude, because, you know, I want to be in the middle. We're past an hour now. I don't want to go on too long, but here is where there's the connection with Somaesthetics, because how do we know the middle? How do we know when enough is enough? We have to be sensitive to it. We have to know this is a problem that we have with obesity. People are obese because they eat too much and they eat too fast. Why do they eat too much and eat too fast? Because they lack the somaesthetic sensitivity to know how fast they're eating and to know when they've had enough. They don't know it's enough until, you know, they're already bloated, you know, like the Monty Python skit with that final thin little mint.
Yeah.
Until they feel the pain of being stuffed, they can't realize that they should stop and that they've actually had enough.
Yeah.
How do you know that you're eating too fast? How do you know that you're eating too much? You have to have awareness and somaesthetic awareness. So one of the chapters in my book, Thinking Through the Body, is called Muscle Memory and the Somaesthetic Pathologies of Everyday Life. Many of the everyday minor pathologies like we have, like eating too fast and having indigestion, or eating too fast and too much and growing too fat, are because we just are spontaneous in our bodily behavior without having that critical somaesthetic reflection dimension. And so one way of finding the mean is knowing somatically, somaesthetically, being able to feel, if I go a bit more, it's going to be past what is good, and knowing when to stop. And that's something that you can get through greater body consciousness.
Yeah, great. Okay. Just my final question, Richard. If people wanted to find out more about your work, how could they go about it?
Well, I think it's not too hard. I have more presence than I would actually like on the internet. I'm very much exposed, but so I can be easily Googled. There's a Somaesthetics network. There's a Somaesthetics Google group. As I said, there's a Journal of Somaesthetics. There's a Somaesthetics Google group that people are welcome to join. It doesn't cost any money, and it's not very intrusive. There are occasional announcements about conferences and publications in Somaesthetics. And there is a journal called the Journal of Somaesthetics. It's an online journal based in Denmark. And there's a new book series called Studies in Somaesthetics that's published in Holland. We haven't published any book yet with the Dutch publisher Brill. So I'm very easy to find on the internet. And of course, the books are also very accessible. Thinking Through the Body is the one that's perhaps the most general and widely diversified in its applications to daily life and the arts. Body consciousness, which you mentioned in the beginning, is more focused on philosophy. And I still think it's accessible to non-academics, but it's maybe demands a bit more intellectual patience.
Okay, well, that's the book that I read of yours, Richard, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, so I'd highly recommend that. Anyway, well, thanks very much for talking to me today, Richard. It's been absolutely fascinating and a real pleasure.
Okay, it's been a pleasure for me, and I wish we could continue this conversation on a nice long walk along the lake where you happen to be living, and I wish you a very beautiful summer to enjoy the environment in which you live.
Well, thank you very much. I might nip down there this evening.
Okay. Okay, bye-bye.
You can find out more about middle way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.